there guys, and thanks for joining us on Gearist TV. On today's episode, we're going to talk about the EM Road N1 from Pearl Izumi. In the past few years, we've seen the running shoe industry take leaps and bounds in many different directions. We've gone from seeing shoes that look more like gloves than shoes, to shoes with big polycarbonate blades on the bottom, to those big bounder shoes that look more like ski boots with a pair of lips on the bottom. We've seen all these different things, but a lot of people have kind of stuck with the traditional, this is what we're going to do, we're not going to change much, we're just going to put a big soft piece of EVA on the bottom of the shoe and be fairly cookie cutter and not really do much in the way of change. During that time, Pearl Izumi, which is a very well established cycling gear brand, Pearl Izumi decided to get into the running shoe game. When they did, the shoes that they came out with were fairly cookie cutter, and there wasn't really much to them in terms of the technology of the midsole and the outsole, and actually as it pertains to the gait. They were fairly soft, just EVA foam. Now the features on the shoe were really cool. Some of the shoes they came out with were light. They had, speed laces and drain holes for triathlon shoes and things like that. But in general, there just wasn't much that was really outstanding, that really just stood out to you about the shoe. But then came Pearl Izumi's Project E-Motion, and I say E-Motion because that's how they say it. Project E-Motion and the E-Motion midsole, with technology such as the dynamic offset, they've really begun to think out of the box, and rather than approaching the shoe from a how does it look, more of a cosmetic standpoint, this is the first time that I personally have seen Pearl Izumi really approach the shoe from a gait and a biomechanical standpoint. So let's talk about the N1, as we're going to call it, because I don't want to say EM Road N1 50 times. First thing we're going to talk about with the N1 is the outsole. Now, the first thing that you might notice if you were holding this, and you can sort of see it just by looking at it here on camera, is that it's primarily made of outsole grade EVA foam. And there are only 3 spots where there is blown rubber. Right up here in the toe, these 2 little chunks right here, this flow line that follows the path of the weight as the stride goes forward, and then this little spot here on the lateral heel. Another feature of the outsole that you may notice, and this kind of spills up into the midsole, is that the toe spring, which toe spring is the upward curvature at the front of a shoe, the toe spring, which typically takes place right up here in front of the metatarsals, has been moved back to under the midfoot. So it's been moved about 20%, give or take, back in the shoe. Now what this is meant to do is, instead of forcing what's called a windlass effect is when the big toe is flexed upward and it creates an arch and basically tightens the entire foot up, instead of forcing that and effectively immobilizing the forefoot and effectively mobilizing all the toes, this actually pulls that toe spring back behind the metatarsal heads, thus relaxing the entire area of the foot metatarsal heads forward. What this does is it allows the foot more freedom and allows it to function more as a foot. Part of kind of the charter of Project E-Motion by Pearl Izumi is simplicity and fluidity, and the outsole really embodies that. As you can see here, these are just lines. There's not much. I'll hold it up closer to the camera. There's not a lot going on in terms of some complicated tread pattern or something like that. It's very simple. And also, there are no moving parts. There are no extra injected gel pads or air pockets or lugs or anything like that. Also, you can see the toe spring being moved back almost gives it a very rocker-like effect. What this does is it's going to create a lot more ground impact, which we'll talk about a little bit more later when we address the dynamic offset theory that takes place in this shoe. I do like that the shoe is not loaded up with a bunch of rubber that's not really ever going to be used in places that it's unnecessary. Another thing that I am a little curious about, and I've got about 60 miles in this shoe right now, I'm a little curious about how it would wear over the long term. Now, I tend to be a very mid to forefoot runner, and what I can say is that here on the lateral side of the shoe, you'll notice right there, where I tend to land on that lateral edge of the shoe, there's a little bit of accelerated wear. It's not huge, and since there are 60 miles on this shoe, that's still pretty good for being 60 miles. But I would question that a little bit. The midsole of the N1 uses something called dynamic offset. Now, what they've done with this shoe is very interesting, because rather than having just kind of a static static drop like, 8 millimeters from here to here or something like that. This has a dynamic offset, which means that throughout the gait, throughout the process of the foot being on the ground, there's a different drop at different points. It's a very, very well thought out method, and actually really complements that kind of fluid form that I mentioned a minute ago. So the drop in the shoe can technically go from somewhere around 7 millimeters down to around 1 millimeter. If we look, and I'll use my iPad as my little table here, this is the shoe kind of at neutral state. Now it's going to rock forward a little bit because of the rocker being pulled far back, or the toe spring being pulled far back. However, that's not how we stand. We stand a little bit back on that heel, and when you do so, it raises the drop, and it raises the stack height rather in the forefoot, thus making the drop less. So when you're moving forward, you're going to impact the ground. Under load, you're going to compress this midsole, and you're going to come down to right about a 1 millimeter drop. It's very, very interesting, and I'm going to show a little video, bam, right there. And while you watch that, you can actually see kind of what I'm talking about. And if you click over to the text version of this review, you'll be able to see what we're talking about there as well. What's nice about that, and complements that really fluid running form that I keep mentioning, is that as you land on the ground, you're going to have more shoe on the ground, and it's actually going to really feel very flowy. And that, again, that's where this rocker almost shape comes in. You're going to feel as though your foot has a lot of contact with the ground, which not only increases cushion because you're contacting in a dynamic, in a moving motion, but it's also going to increase ground feel because your foot is going to be able to spend more time in genuine contact with the ground, not just kind of ancillary contact on the ground by a separate heel pod and a separate forefoot pod. As midsoles go, the midsole of the N1 is very, very hard. You can pick it up, push on it. You'll notice the durometer is very, very high. It's interesting, and I thought that that was going to make the ride a little rough, actually kind of clumpy, but it never did, because again, that dynamic offset really helps the foot to have a very fluid contact with the ground. The sock liner, which rather than including the upper review of this, upper part of this review, will include in the midsole, the sock liner is actually very interesting because it has a bunch of different densities. So when you go to the forefoot to the heel, for instance, at these 2 points, you're going to have a larger drop than if you get closer. This enhances that fluid, that dynamic offset, and is going to make the drop of the shoe, again, a constantly changing thing that's going to adapt to many, many different runners' feet. And I think that's something we're going to touch on later, so stay tuned. Now let's talk about the upper. I really enjoy the upper of the shoe. It's primarily built of a woven mesh, and we're going to talk about how stretchy it is in a minute. Primarily built of a woven mesh, and any strapping is made by these heat bonded elements. Again, these are not stitched on, so there are no real stitches up here to speak of. The laces, rather than having individually stitched eyelets, actually come through the different support elements. So you can see here on the heel support element and the ankle support element, the laces come through there. Right here in the middle, these two laces come through the medial strapping, and then down in the forefoot, they come kind of down around the bottom of the throat there. So that's going to save a little bit on weight by not having individually stitched or metal eyelets in this. The collar of the shoe, this part right around here, has ample padding, and something that is a little bit of a pet peeve of mine is that a lot of collars tend to have a lot of padding and really shove the foot forward. They're pushing into the Achilles there. That does not really happen with this. The padding is very nice and supple, but, and I'll talk about this in a minute, because the heel counter sits much lower than most other shoes, it allows a lot more freedom and flexibility in the rear of the foot there. Internally, the shoe is pretty much seamless. The only seams that are in there, which you may be able to see, where it changes from yellow to this orange right here, that seam right there is actually taped over with a heat bonded element that is meant to create a very seamless feel front to back. And I've also noticed that this shoe wears really, really nicely barefoot. The back of this the back of this mesh is lined with an even finer weave, so it's a lot more smooth on the foot, and this transition plate between the collar area and the forefoot area is actually really, really smooth as well. Now let me talk about the heel counter that I mentioned a second ago. In most shoes, the heel counter, which is a stiff piece right here in the rear of the heel, is going to come all the way up to the top of the collar. Now in this shoe, it only goes about halfway. You can see it actually stops just at the top of this black area that I'm pointing to here. What's cool about that, aside from allowing for, again, flexibility and kind of leaving the Achilles alone, is that it saves a little bit of weight. There's not really any need for it unless you have some gigantic calcaneus. that is going to still provide enough stability because it certainly comes up traditionally toward the front. It comes up to a traditional spot to right about here, but back here it doesn't have a lot of superfluous material that's going to otherwise bulk up the shoe. Now the mesh, which I told you we'd talk about how stretchy it was, I'll try to show you. The mesh is very, very stretchy. You can see me putting my hand in there and kind of trying to stretch it out. What's nice about a stretchy material, especially one that has this kind of elasticity, is that if you have a wider foot, it's going to allow you to be in the shoe. It's going to accommodate for that. If you have a more narrow foot, the stretchiness of it is still going to kind of keep your foot where it should be, and it's not going to be too sloppy. If you just put a bunch of non-stretchy material to make up for that wide foot, you'd have a bunch of bunched material. I just said bunch a lot of times. You'd have bunched up material if you had a more narrow or low volume foot and had to tighten it down. But this being stretchy leaves plenty of room for people that have a lower volume foot or people that may have a slightly wider foot. Now this is a traditional, I think, a D width, but again, that stretchy material is going to accommodate a lot of people. Now, while this shoe has very little in the way of kind of lateral support, I don't see that as really being a problem. This is meant to go straight and fast. It's not necessarily a technical shoe. If you were to run this on a more technical course, something with a lot of hard turns, 90-degree turns, switchbacks, things like that, you may find yourself slipping a little bit, but because of, again, that dynamic offset and the fact that the heel counter, and the fact that the sock liner really supports and wraps the foot quite nicely, I don't think you're really going to feel that as much as you might think. Let's talk about fit for a second. So the fit of the shoe in terms of sizing is right on. This is an 11 and fits me just as I would expect it to. Now, as I mentioned, that upper is very stretchy. I can see definitely somebody seeing this shoe that may have a wider foot and looking at it and just dismissing it offhand without trying it on, but I would strongly discourage that. It's well worth putting on if you're looking for this type of shoe because, again, this mesh is going to really work with the foot, and it's not going to be overly baggy if you've got a low volume foot and overly tight if you've got a super, super wide foot. Now let's talk about the ride of this shoe. The ride is very smooth. When I first got in the shoe, I had to kind of make a shift in my thought process. The first instinct that I had was to, think about it like it's a rockered shoe and run in it like it's a rockered shoe. But as soon as I let go of that thought and just kind of let my gait do what my gait was going to do, the fluidity and the smoothness of the shoe and how it complements, doesn't force the foot to do something, but it complements the natural biomechanics, was really, really evident by being not evident. It was actually a really, really nice thing to find out. I've run up to 10 miles at a time in this shoe, and again, I have about 60 miles in it right now, and I have to say that there's not really a lot of fatigue because you're not really working that hard to kind of create a false gait pattern. This is really complementary of your natural gait pattern. Additionally, it really feels like a shoe that when you look at some websites, it may say it's got a 7mm drop or offset, but it doesn't. It runs like a shoe with a really, really low drop, which again, at mid stance is right about 1mm. Overall, the N1 from Pearl Izumi is a great shoe that, because of its dynamic offset system, I think is going to be accessible by a lot of people. In the past, as I mentioned, Pearl Izumi's running shoes have been kind of bland, and no offense to you guys, but that's just the way that I perceived it. There was not a lot going on. I really have to give Pearl Izumi big, big kudos for thinking outside the box with this one and approaching the manufacture of this shoe from a biomechanical standpoint, not necessarily from a design, let's see how many bells and whistles we can put on it type of standpoint. I really appreciate that. Coming in at 7.7 ounces for a men's size 9, the shoe is actually really quite nice. I mean, it's not a super light racing flat or anything like that, but it is definitely a shoe that can be worn in many races. It works with the foot, again, because of the stretchy upper, but also because of the complementary biomechanical kind of the E-motion outsole here. They work together with the foot, so it's not something that you're going to be like, oh, there's this shoe on my foot that's this foreign entity. Rather, it's really going to work with the foot quite well. As I mentioned earlier, there were a couple of areas where I saw a tiny bit of accelerated wear, primarily here on the lateral edge. Now, it's nothing huge, it's nothing over the top, it's not like I'm burning through that in 50 miles. If it's something that I see over time, again, I've only got about 60 miles in the shoe so far. If it's something that I see over time, I'll definitely update this review as well as the text review on Gearist.com. So be sure to check back. At $115, the N1 is really accessible and well priced in the high-end running shoe market. Because of its price, I think it's going to be something that a lot of people are going to want to try out. And again, I would encourage you not just to look at it and dismiss it offhand because it looks like a rockered shoe, but I would encourage you to try it on and go for a tiny jog in it, preferably outside, not necessarily on a treadmill, because I really think that the fluidity and the smoothness of the shoe is going to be striking to a lot of people. Part of the reason that it's going to appeal to so many people, in my opinion, is again, because of that dynamic offset, which is going to adjust not just to the foot as a generic foot, but to everybody's foot individually on a unique individual basis. Thank you guys so much for joining us for this episode of Gearist TV. Please click on over to Gearist.com. Take a look around, click on the reviews, let us know what you think. If you've got any questions or comments about this video review, please leave them in the comments section below. It doesn't cost you anything. We want to hear from you. We've had a couple people commenting on things and we love to see that. So leave a comment and let us know what you think. If you've run in this shoe, we'd also really like to know what you think there. Please share the video anywhere and everywhere you can, Twitter, Facebook, wherever you want. We'd love for you guys to spread the word about our reviews to your friends. And please, when you see it in a minute, click the subscribe button. It's going to be right where it's going to be over here? It's going to be somewhere on here. Click the beautiful blue subscribe button and subscribe to Gearist on YouTube. Thank you guys so much, and we'll see you next time. As always, thank you guys so much for watching this episode of Gearist TV. Please click on over to find us at Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And while you're here, please click on that beautiful blue subscribe button. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you next time.